January 9, 1945. Tokyo. The air raid sirens wail through the frozen winter night. In the underground command bunker beneath the Imperial Army headquarters, General Masakazu Kawabe stands before a wall-mounted map of the Japanese home islands, each city marked with a small rising sun. His breath fogs in the unheated concrete chamber. Above him, at 30,000 feet, higher than Mount Fuji itself, the first wave of B-29 Superfortresses crosses into Japanese airspace. Their aluminum bodies catch the moonlight like silver needles, threading through clouds his pilots cannot reach. He places one hand on the cold wall. The sirens continue. He knows his fighters will not climb high enough. He knows his anti-aircraft guns will fire uselessly into empty sky. He knows, with the certainty of a man watching his own execution, that there is nothing he can do but witness. For 4 years, Japanese commanders had prepared their soldiers and citizens for sacrifice. They had spoken of Yamato Damashii, the indomitable spirit that would compensate for industrial disadvantage. They had promised that discipline, that Bushido, that the will of the emperor himself would overcome American material superiority. They had watched their forces sweep across the Pacific with astonishing speed in 1941 and 1942, conquering territories that European powers had held for centuries. Singapore fell. The Philippines fell. Burma, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, all fell before the sword of the empire. And in those early victories, Japanese commanders believed they had discovered a fundamental truth: that spiritual strength could defeat industrial might, that one Japanese soldier was worth 10 American soldiers, that the soft, luxury-addicted democracy across the Pacific would never endure the rigors of total war. Then the B-29s came, and with them came the realization that they had miscalculated everything. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was not merely an airplane. It was a pressurized, climate-controlled city in the sky, carrying 11 men in shirt-sleeve comfort through altitudes where the outside temperature reached 40 degrees below zero. Each bomber cost $600,000, more than the annual military budget of some nations. Inside its sealed cabin, American crews ate hot meals prepared in electric ovens, drank coffee from thermoses, breathed pure oxygen, and navigated by radar systems that could see through clouds and darkness. The bombardier lay in a plexiglass nose dome with a Norden bomb sight worth more than its weight in gold. Behind him, for right, are 3350 engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, burned fuel at a rate of 200 gallons per hour. A single B-29 consumed more gasoline in one mission than the entire Japanese garrison on some Pacific islands received in a month. Japanese commanders read the intelligence reports with disbelief that slowly curdled into despair. The Americans were building these impossible machines at a rate of 150 per month. They were training crews in specialized schools with unlimited fuel for practice runs. They were stockpiling bombs on airfields in the Mariana Islands, islands that Japan had controlled just months earlier, in quantities that exceeded the entire Japanese bomb production for a year. General Kawabe received a report in December 1944 estimating that the Americans had already delivered more tonnage of bombs to the Marianas than Japan had dropped in the entire China campaign since 1937. But numbers on paper could not prepare them for the reality of watching it happen. On the night of March 9, 1945, Major General Seizo Arisu stood on the roof of his command post in eastern Tokyo as 334 B-29s approached the city in a low-altitude formation. They came at 7,000 feet instead of their usual 30,000, a tactic that stunned Japanese observers who assumed the Americans would always choose safety over effectiveness. The first Pathfinder aircraft dropped clusters of incendiaries that ignited in bright crosses, marking the aiming points. Then the main force followed, each bomber releasing its load of M69 cluster bombs, 2,000 pounds of napalm-filled cylinders that burst apart above the streets and scattered burning gel across wooden homes, shops, temples, and schools. Arisu watched the fire spread. He had witnessed bombing raids in China, had seen what Japanese incendiaries did to Chinese cities. This was different. The Americans had studied Tokyo's layout, its wind patterns, its construction materials, its population density. They had calculated the optimal altitude for cluster dispersal, the ideal payload mixture, the weather conditions that would create a firestorm. They had turned bombing into a science, and Tokyo was the laboratory. Within 30 minutes, the individual fires merged into a single conflagration that generated its own weather system. Tornado-force winds that sucked oxygen from underground shelters and sent sheets of flame horizontal across the city. The temperature at ground level exceeded 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Glass melted. Steel buckled. Water in the canals boiled. Arisu stood on his rooftop untouched and watched 16 square miles of his capital burn. The smoke rose so high that B-29 crews at 7,000 feet flew through updrafts that threw their multi-ton aircraft around like leaves in a typhoon. They reported smelling burning flesh inside their pressurized cabins. 85,000 people died that night, more than would die in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima 5 months later. When dawn came, Arisu walked through the ruins. The streets were lined with charred bodies, many huddled in family groups, frozen in the moment of death. Canals were choked with corpses, people who had jumped into the water to escape the heat, only to be boiled alive or suffocated by smoke. The steel-reinforced concrete buildings still stood, but they were hollow shells, their contents incinerated, their windows blown out, their walls stained black with soot. Everything combustible had vanished. In his report to Imperial Headquarters, Arisu wrote simply, "The enemy possesses the power to eliminate our cities from existence. We have no countermeasure." The psychological effect on Japanese military leadership was profound and precisely calibrated. American planners understood that they were not merely destroying industrial capacity. They were demonstrating absolute dominion. Each raid followed the same pattern. Sirens, then the silver bombers appearing at untouchable altitude, then the methodical destruction of a designated target zone, then the bombers departing unscathed while the city burned. Japanese commanders mobilized every available fighter, positioned every anti-aircraft battery, implemented new tactics, new formations, new strategies. Nothing worked. The B-29s operated in a realm beyond Japanese reach, and the few that were damaged simply flew back to Saipan or Guam or Tinian, where American mechanics repaired them overnight using unlimited spare parts shipped from factories in Kansas and Ohio and California. Colonel Takashiro Hattori, a senior staff officer in the Imperial Army General Staff, kept a private diary that was recovered after the war. His entry from April 13, 1945, reads, "Today we received reports that the Americans have bombed Tokyo again with 150 B-29s. 0 losses for the enemy. Our fighters shot down nothing. We expended 12,000 anti-aircraft shells and hit nothing. The B-29 has become a symbol of our impotence. Each time the sirens sound, we are reminded that the enemy can reach into our homeland and strike at will, while we cannot even scratch their aircraft. The men are beginning to ask, if we cannot defend our own capital, how can we claim to defend the empire? If the Americans can produce such bombers by the hundred, what else can they produce? What can they not produce?" That question, what can they not produce, haunted Japanese commanders as the bombing campaign expanded. 67 cities were targeted. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama all received the same treatment as Tokyo. The B-29s came in daylight now, flying in formation as if daring Japan to respond. Sometimes they dropped leaflets before the bombing, warning civilians to evacuate, listing the cities that would be hit next. The leaflets were psychological weapons, more devastating than the bombs themselves. They announced, "We will tell you where and when we will strike, and you will be unable to stop us." Some Japanese commanders advocated suppressing the leaflets, claiming they damaged morale. Others argued that the truth was visible in the burning cities. Suppressing leaflets would change nothing. The B-29 became Japan's recurring nightmare, the mechanical harbinger that appeared in clear skies and erased cities. Its sound, the deep thrumming of 16 or 3350 engines multiplied across a 100-bomber formation, was the sound of American industrial supremacy made audible. Japanese propaganda had taught the population that Americans were soft, that they loved comfort more than victory, that they would negotiate rather than endure sacrifice. The B-29 refuted every claim. Here was a nation that could design a pressurized bomber, manufacture it by the thousand, train crews by the hundred, establish airbases across the Pacific, and conduct a systematic campaign to burn Japan into submission, all while simultaneously fighting Germany in Europe, feeding Allied armies across 3 continents, and maintaining civilian prosperity at home. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, he cited in his rescript a new and most cruel bomb, the atomic weapon. But Japanese commanders knew the atomic bombs were merely punctuation marks on a sentence already written by conventional bombing. The B-29s had already killed more than 500,000 Japanese civilians, destroyed 60% of the urban areas in 67 cities, and demonstrated beyond argument that continued resistance was national suicide. General Kawabe, the man who had watched the first raids with his hand on the cold bunker wall, wrote in his post-war testimony, "The B-29 represented everything we had misunderstood about America. We believed they were a nation of shopkeepers who would trade rather than fight. Instead, they were a nation of engineers who turned warfare itself into an industrial process, who built aircraft that flew higher than our fighters could climb, who produced bombs faster than we could rebuild, who reduced our cities to ash, and then told us which city would burn next. We did not lose to American soldiers. We lost to American factories." The silver bombers have long since been retired, dismantled, melted down for scrap. But their shadow remains in the historical memory as a reminder of what democracy in full industrial fury can accomplish. Not the righteousness of it, not the necessity, but the sheer capacity. The capacity to manufacture 3,800 B-29s in 4 years. The capacity to train 50,000 crewmen. The capacity to deliver 170,000 tons of bombs across 6,000 miles of ocean. The capacity to turn a city into a firestorm and return the next night to burn another. That capacity, more than any ideology or speech or treaty, was what Japanese commanders saw from their bunkers as they watched the silver needles stitch fire across their homeland sky, the terrible arithmetic of abundance against scarcity, of industry against spirit, of what is when will alone is not enough.